I rise this morning to speak directly to my friends on the other side of the aisle. Now is the time to put country before party. I understand the pull of party loyalty. I understand deference to a new president. But from what we have seen in the first 2 weeks of this administration, party loyalty is demanding too much of my Republican colleagues on several issues. On the matter of the cabinet, on the matter of the president's executive order on immigration, and on the matter of dealing with Russia, we need Republicans to set aside partisan considerations in favor of doing what's best for the country. Otherwise, our institutions of government, our Constitution, and core American ideals may be eroded. My friends on the other side of the aisle are going along with the president and treating many of these things as if they were normal. But America knows they are not. We need Republicans to start recognizing it, saying it, and start stepping up to the plate to do something about it. I understand my Republican colleagues will go along with the president 90% of the time, but there are certain issues that are too important that demand putting country above party. Now is the time to put country above party. First, on the cabinet. Our norms of good government and, above all, ethics are being tested by a cabinet unlike any other I have seen in my time in public office. There are so many billionaires with so many conflicts of interest and so little expertise in the issues they'd oversee. Take the nomination we are now considering, Betsy DeVos for Education Secretary. In my mind, she is the least qualified nominee in a historically unqualified cabinet. On conflicts of interest, she ranks among the worst. In her ethics agreement, which was delivered to the committee after the first hearing, it was revealed she'd keep interests in 3 family-owned trusts that have holdings in companies that could be affected by matters related to the Department of Education. Independent ethics watchdogs have criticized her ethics agreement for failing to deal with these conflicts of interest. On philosophy of education, her views are extreme. She seems to constantly demean the main purpose of her job, public education. 9 in 10 American kids attend public schools. Her views on public education are a major concern, particularly for senators from rural areas. There's not a lot of choice of schools outside major metropolitan areas. If you don't have a public school, a good public school in your neighborhood, in your community, you have nothing. Any senator from a rural state should be worried about her commitment to public education. We in New York have the 3rd largest rural population in America. I am worried for those schools where if the school's no good, you don't have much choice. You don't have any choice. Above all, and on basic competence, Ms. DeVos has failed to make the grade. She didn't seem to know about the federal education law that guarantees education to students with disabilities. She couldn't unequivocally say that guns shouldn't be in the schools. And she didn't seem to know about a long simmering debate in education policy about measuring growth versus proficiency. Frankly, Ms. DeVos's answers at the hearings were embarrassing. Not only for her, but for my Republican colleagues on the committee, who rushed her nomination through with 5 minutes of questions, only 1 round, and at 5 p.m. Madam President, cabinet secretaries can't be expected to know everything, but this is different. The nominee for Secretary of Education doesn't know some of the most basic facts about education policy. She has failed to show proficiency, and there is no longer any time for growth. Mr. President, Madam President, the American people are speaking in one loud voice against this nominee. I've had many people come up to me in New York and said, I voted for Donald Trump. but I'm making calls about this nominee. Americans across the country in red states and blue states have been flooding our offices with phone calls and emails asking the Senate to vote no on Betsy DeVos. Local newspaper editorial boards, many of them that endorse Trump, are saying the same thing. My friends, the senators from Maine and Alaska, were profiled in courage last week when they announced their opposition to her nomination. But unfortunately, so far, they are the exception. We need just one more vote, and we can get a lot better Secretary of Education than the one who was nominated. I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to follow the courageous example of the senators from Maine and Alaska. We have an obligation as senators, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as senators, to evaluate these nominees and their fitness for office, because these nominees are going to wield immense power over the lives of Americans for the next 4 years. I ask my Republican colleagues to look into their conscience and cast their votes tomorrow, not based on party loyalty, but based on whether or not Ms. DeVos is qualified to be our nation's leader on education policy. If one doesn't measure up, the Senate has a responsibility to reject the nomination. I realize it rarely occurs, but this should be an exception because she is so uniquely unqualified, whether it comes to competence, whether it comes to philosophy against the public schools, or whether it comes to conflicts of interest, which still exist in far too many instances with Ms. DeVos's holdings. Second, Madam President, the President's executive order on immigration and refugees is so poorly constructed, so haphazardly implemented, so legally and constitutionally dubious, and so wrong in terms of what America is all about, so contrary to our basic values as Americans, that my Republican friends should feel a duty to country to help us rescind it. Several members on the other side, I think it's over a dozen, have expressed concerns about it. Several spoke out strongly and unequivocally about imposing any type of ban during the campaign. But now that we have such a ban, they are unfortunately silent. It's time for that silence to end, and for Republicans to step up to the plate and start backing up their words with actions. On Friday, the order was temporarily blocked by a federal judge, Judge Robart. On Saturday, the President questioned his credibility via tweet and then asked the country to blame any potential attacks on the country on the judge and the courts. He is not a so-called judge, as the President treated, but rather a Senate-confirmed Bush appointee. Now, Madam President, that's not how we do things here in America. There's a separation of powers for a reason. An independent judiciary is absolutely necessary to ensure presidents and Congresses do not break the law or impinge on the Constitution. But this president has shown a certain callousness when it comes to judges who rule against his whim. Judge Curiel during the campaign, Judge Robart now. Instead of attacking the judge, the president should be working with Congress to tighten up security where it's actually needed. The president has said, well, if there are attacks, the judge will be to blame. I remind him, not one attack on U.S. soil has been perpetrated by a refugee from one of the 7 countries in the executive order. This order doesn't make us any safer. If anything, the executive order increases the risk of lone wolf attacks, our greatest threat. That's what happened in San Bernardino. That's what happened in Orlando. And no authority less than Senator John McCain has said exactly that it will increase the likelihood of attacks by these lone wolves, these disaffected people who are egged on by the evil ISIS. So, I make this offer to my friends on the other side of the aisle. Join Democrats in rescinding the executive order, and we will work with you in a bipartisan way, in good faith, to actually make our country safer. Close up that visa waiver program, where people from countries, just because they're generally friendly to us, those countries are not checked. We know that places like France and Belgium have homegrown terrorists lured by ISIS. They can get on a plane and come here far more easily than a refugee from those 7 countries. Let's tighten that up. But instead, the president picked this executive order. Lord knows how he came to it. And every expert on terrorism will say there are a lot more important things and better things that we need to do. So let me repeat, the stakes are too high for party loyalty to stand in the way of doing what's right to protect this country. We ought to scrap the order and start over. The order not only does not protect us from terrorism, but make it worse, but it stands in the face of what America is all about, a country that has welcomed immigrants, as the beautiful lady with the torch in the harbor, in the city in which I live, has beckoned us for generations. Finally, Mr. President, I ask my Republican colleagues to put country over party when it comes to Russia. This administration has shown a disquieting reluctance to criticize Russia when it flouts international norms and laws. The administration seems hesitant to enforce new sanctions and has even hinted at relaxing existing sanctions on what has always been probably our most formidable enemy along with ISIS, Russia and Putin. Unbelievably, just yesterday, the president insinuated that the American and Russian governments were somehow morally equivalent. When asked about Putin's authoritarian regime by Bill O'Reilly, President Trump responded, "There are a lot of killers. You think our country's so innocent?" Can you imagine if a Democrat had said that? Every one of these seats would be filled with people decrying that kind of moral equivalence. Russia, a dictatorship where Putin kills his enemies, imprisons the press, and causes trouble anywhere he can in the world. Morally equivalent to this great land? Come on, where are you? You know if a Democrat said it, you'd be just howling at the moon. Rightfully so. And here, I don't hear much. Mr. President, Vladimir Putin has little or no respect for the diversity of his people, for the freedom of religion and expression, for a free press, for free and fair elections in Russia and in America, it seems. And he has demonstrated on more than one occasion he'll go to any length to silence political dissidents, including murdering them. Does that sound like America, I would ask President Trump? Maybe in the President Trump's mind it does, but it sure doesn't to just about every American. It's not the America that this body represents. My Republican colleagues, as I said, ought to be aghast. I don't think anyone from the other side would associate himself or herself with those comments. I am encouraged that the Republican leader and other Senate Republicans criticized the president for these dangerous remarks. But what worries me most is the policy. Russia is a persistent and strategic threat to this nation. Will this administration cozy up to Putin and his oligarchs and relax sanctions? Will they look the other way when Russia supports separatists in Ukraine and commits human rights violations in Syria alongside Iran, Hezbollah, and the Assad regime? Putin is the kind of bully where if you give him an inch, he takes 10 miles. We all have come across people like that. President Trump's rhetoric is ceding more of the battle space to our enemy each day. So what we must do in this body is ensure that current sanctions stay in place and are robustly enforced. We also need to increase sanctions on Russia for its interference in our election. We ask our colleagues, step up to the plate, do what you know is right, and join us in making sure that the president cannot unilaterally reduce sanctions and that we strengthen sanctions for what he has tried to do in our election. Madam President, the stakes are too high to let loyalty to this president, any president, stop this body from doing the right thing for the American people. On the cabinet, and particularly Ms. DeVos, on the executive order and the lack of respect for an independent judiciary, and on Russia, I ask my Republican colleagues once again to consider principle over party and their duty to country before deference to the president. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, over the last few weeks, people across the country have continued to make their voices heard in opposition to the nomination of Betsy DeVos. Moms and dads, grandmothers and grandfathers, students, young and old, in cities and towns, in urban, suburban, and rural communities. People are standing up and they will not be silenced. Thousands upon thousands have joined protests in their communities. Hundreds of thousands have emailed or called their senators, jamming our phone lines, swamping the voicemail system, and shattering records. Millions have engaged on social media, sharing information with their friends and signing petitions and pressuring their elected officials. And, Madam President, it has made a difference. Every single Democrat will be standing with their constituents and opposing Betsy DeVos. And just last week, 2 Republicans announced their opposition as well. And I can tell you, I know for a fact there are other Republicans who are feeling the heat and could come around. So, Madam President, this nomination is dead even right now, on the razor's edge. 50 senators, Democrats and Republicans, will vote to reject Betsy DeVos. And we need just one more Republican to join us, to stand on the side of students and parents and public education in America and say no to Betsy DeVos. So, Madam President, I come to the floor today to kick off the final day of debate on this nomination. Now, I spoke at length on Friday, making my case for why the Senate should oppose Betsy DeVos. And Democrats will hold the floor for the next 24 hours until the final vote to do everything we can to persuade just one more Republican to join us. And I strongly encourage people across the country to join us. Double down on your advocacy. Keep making your voices heard for these last 24 hours. Madam President, over the past few weeks, I've heard a number of Republicans wonder why Democrats and so many parents and teachers across the country were so focused on this nomination in this moment. Now, President Trump has done so much in these first few weeks, and so many of the people he has nominated to run critical agencies have not been people I can support. But what is it about Betsy DeVos that has inspired so much grassroots energy and opposition across this country? Well, Madam President, I think I understand. It's pretty clear to me. I think it's that for the vast majority of people across the country, public education isn't just another issue. It's different. For those of us who owe everything we have to the strong public education we received, for those who saw our children and grandchildren move through our public schools, For those of us who've walked into a public classroom ourselves to teach, or have friends or family who've dedicated their lives to teaching. For those of us who see the role strong public schools play in our communities, especially our rural communities, often offering an educational and a community resource where it simply wouldn't otherwise be offered. We believe that a commitment to strong public schools is part of America's core. The idea that every student in every community should have the opportunities that strong public schools offer. This is a notion that is embedded in our values. It's who we are. It's in our blood. So, Madam President, for those people across the country who feel that way, who believe those things, the nomination of Betsy DeVos truly hits close to home. It was a slap in the face because she doesn't approach this the way most of us do. She doesn't cherish public education. She doesn't value it. She is someone who has dedicated her career and her inherited fortune to privatizing public schools, to tearing down public education, to defunding it in order to push more taxpayer dollars into private schools and for-profit charters. She has called public education, quote, a dead end. From where she sits, from a distance, she has called it, quote, an embarrassment. She has disparaged those who work in our public schools, saying that our best and our brightest, quote, steer clear. She has said education is, quote, an industry. An industry? Well, for someone like her, a billionaire right-wing activist who spent her career and her inherited fortune buying and selling companies, she just doesn't understand a, quote, industry that isn't focused on profits and that doesn't exist in the free market. So, Madam President, when people across the country hear someone like Betsy DeVos say these things about public education, when they hear a right-wing conservative billionaire more focused on her anti-government ideology than on helping our students, when they see that someone who has spent her career trying to destroy public schools has been nominated to lead the federal agency dedicated to public education, well, they start to pay some attention. And, Madam President, when they see that person in a Senate hearing so clearly lack any understanding of the issues, when they see her unable to explain basic concepts in education policy, unwilling to make basic commitments to not privatizing or defunding our public schools, confused about the need for federal protections for students with disabilities, and so committed to a right-wing agenda that she pointed to the need for guns in our schools to protect against, and I quote, potential grizzly bears? In response, by the way, to a question from a senator representing the Newtown families. Well, people across the country pay even more attention, and they start to make their voices heard. So, Madam President, I am not surprised that opposition to Betsy DeVos has caught fire across the country. And I am not surprised that people are talking about it to their friends and writing letters to the senators and showing up to protest when they've never done anything like that before. Because this is about their kids, their schools, their communities. It's about the core idea that we are a nation that invests in strong public education and one that strives to guarantee the promise and opportunity it affords to every student in our country. Not that public education is perfect. Of course not. We have a lot of work to do. But that work should be directed towards strengthening public schools, not tearing them down. And the belief that public education is something that should be valued as an important piece of the fabric of this nation and the expansion of our middle class, not scorned and ridiculed by billionaires who never had any use for it themselves. Madam President, I spent a lot of time Friday here laying out my case in detail opposing Betsy DeVos. I talked about the open questions that are remaining regarding her tangled finances and potential conflicts of interest. I ran through the strong concerns with her record, her lack of experience, and her lack of clear understanding of basic education issues. I discussed my strong belief that her vision for education in America is deeply at odds with where parents and students and families across our country want to go, and went through the process how Republicans jammed this nominee through our committee, cutting corners and doing everything possible to protect her from scrutiny. So, Madam President, I won't go through all that again now, but I do want to make one more point, one that I hope will be compelling to my Republican friends who are still resisting pressure from their constituents and sticking with Betsy DeVos. And that is this: no matter what you think about Betsy DeVos's policy ideas, no matter what you think of her qualifications to run this agency, no matter what you think about her personal understanding of the issues or her financial entanglements, one thing is very clear. If she is confirmed, she would enter this job as the most controversial and embattled secretaries in the history of this department. She would start this job with no credibility inside the agency she is supposed to lead, with no influence in Congress, as the punchline in late-night comedy shows, and without the confidence of the American people. Madam President, a vote for Betsy DeVos is a vote for a Secretary of Education who is likely to succeed only in further dividing us on education issues, and who may try to take steps to implement her anti-student agenda, but would do so with people across the country and so many of us in the Senate on guard and ready to fight back. So I urge my Republican friends, and we just need one more, let's cut this off right now. Let's ask President Trump to send us someone who is qualified, who understands the issues, and who truly cares about public education. And together, let's stand with our constituents and say no to Betsy DeVos. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me start by thanking Senator Murray and the members of the Help Committee for the work they've done to cast light on the record and the lack of record of Ms. Betsy DeVos, President Trump's nominee to be Secretary of Education. As the senator from Washington has told us, the more the American people learn about the record of Betsy DeVos, the more concerned they become. The American people are making their voices heard in every Senate office. The switchboard has been essentially shut down, and I can tell you that I've received over 14,000 calls from Maryland on this nominee alone. People are calling because the more they look at the record, the more they realize this nominee's lack of commitment to the essential mission of the Department of Education. And that mission is to provide every child in America with access to a quality public education. This concern about the nominee is shared across political parties. As Senator Susan Collins of Maine said on this floor, Ms. DeVos's concentration on vouchers, quote, raises the question about whether she fully appreciates that the Secretary of Education's primary focus must be on helping states, communities, and parents, teachers and school board members and administrators to strengthen our public schools. Our mission must be to provide every child, regardless of zip code, with access to a high-quality neighborhood public school. It is absolutely true, Madam President, that in too many places around this country, we are failing to meet the goal. But the response to a troubled school should not be to walk away from it in favor of sketchy voucher schemes. Instead, we must work together to provide the necessary resources and interventions to help those schools and those students achieve success. Over the last 2 years, I've spent a lot of time traveling over the great state of Maryland. I visited schools, talked to college students, heard from parents. And no matter where I went, in every part of our state, everybody wanted the same thing: a good school, affordable college, either community college or four-year colleges, and a fair shot at reaching their dreams. The United States Department of Education is supposed to help them get that opportunity. Let me take a moment to talk about what the Department of Education means to some neighborhoods in my state of Maryland. Not long ago, I visited a pair of community schools in Baltimore City: the historic Samuel Coleridge Taylor Elementary School in Upton Druid Heights in West Baltimore, and the Benjamin Franklin High School in Brooklyn in South Baltimore. Upton Druid Heights is a historic African-American community in Baltimore. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, jazz great Cab Calloway, and civil rights pioneer Lily Mae Carroll Jackson all walked its streets. But today, it's a community in distress. Most of its children live in poverty. 95% of the students at Samuel Coleridge Taylor Elementary are on free or reduced lunch. Despite its challenges, it has a strong faith-based institutions and community groups. Ms. DeVos's approach to schools like Samuel Coleridge Taylor has been to give up on them, to abandon them, and divert resources to voucher programs. Fortunately, the Department of Education did not abandon this school. In 2012, it designated Upton Druid Heights as a promise neighborhood. The department provided resources to support comprehensive services for families. These include Be More for Healthy Babies, which has dramatically reduced infant mortality rates in the city; Parent University, to help educate parents of young children; and Financial Literacy and Education, to help filling out income tax reform forms and help families manage their budgets. In 2012, Samuel Coleridge Taylor became a community school. It has a community school coordinator, a position that can be filled using funds under Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provides financial assistance to schools with high numbers of children from low-income families. The community school coordinator works with parents and students and educators and community residents to learn the needs of the neighborhood and form partnerships to meet them. The University of Maryland School of Social Work, which is located just down the road, joined them to provide trauma training so that teachers could recognize and respond to trauma among the children and go on home visits to work with families. They received a grant to build a first ever playground on campus, something that most schools take for granted. Local churches provided safe spaces for kids. The Weinberg Foundation donated a beautiful library. There's a job center where parents can look for employment, and a food bank to send kids home with something to eat over the weekend. The school was transformed into a place where kids want to be, receiving the Mayor's Award for the greatest drop in students at risk for chronic absenteeism. It's been a success story. In a little different part of town, Ben Franklin High School exists, and it's isolated geographically in the Brooklyn neighborhood. It's on a peninsula on the southern part of the city. It's a historic waterfront neighborhood with strong ties to manufacturing. The Brooklyn community built ships for the United States in World War II. Many families in Brooklyn have been there for generations. As manufacturing left and Bethlehem Steel closed, Bethlehem Steel, which provided about 12,000 good-paying manufacturing jobs, as it closed, times got tougher for those working families. In the year 2011, Benjamin Franklin was one of the bottom 5% schools in the state of Maryland. Again, one of those schools that this nominee would have walked away from in favor of vouchers. Again, the good news is the Department of Education did not walk away. It provided extra funding to help turn things around. Using the community schools model, they assessed and responded to the needs of the students. Interns from the University of Maryland School of Social Work provide mental health services. The United Way offers a workforce development program and an on-site early childhood development center that helps teen parents graduate knowing their children have quality care. A family stability program helps families avoid homelessness. CSX is working with the school to build a football field. And students work together with their neighbors to take ownership of their community and protest the placement of an incinerator near them because they figured that this low-income neighborhood was a good target to put an incinerator, but the community fought back and won. They put thousands of hours into community service, including Chesapeake Bay cleanup. The school's Office of Student Service Learning helps connect students to internships and job training programs. In Brooklyn, the crime rate and the teen pregnancy rates have dropped, and attendance at Ben Franklin is up. When I asked the students what they liked about the school, they said, "We feel like someone cares now." And everyone is positive. At both these schools, Samuel Coleridge Taylor and Ben Franklin, the principals told me that the community schools model allowed them to form partnerships to meet the needs of their students' lives so that they could focus on delivering a high-quality education. And because the students' needs are being met more comprehensively, the students can focus on learning. And because you have a team outside of the teachers who's helping provide some services to these kids, the teachers can focus on teaching. It's important for us to understand that every child who walks through the doors of a school has a unique family circumstance and their own individual needs. The community school approach emphasizes the fact that no school is an island into itself. Every school is part of a neighborhood, and we need to understand the special circumstances of the children and families in those neighborhoods. And it's not just for urban schools like Samuel Coleridge Taylor and Ben Franklin. Community schools have shown success in rural areas of Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Montana, and across the country. Mr. President, this idea that every child should receive a good public education is as old as our republic itself. Our nation's founders knew the contribution of education to the success of our democracy. They knew that an educated population would be a strong safeguard against tyranny. In a letter in 1786, Thomas Jefferson wrote, and I quote, "I think by far the most important bill in our whole code is that for the diffusion of knowledge among the people. No other sure foundation can be devised for the preservation of freedom and happiness." As early as 1779, Jefferson was putting forward legislation to create a public school system that would give children a fair start. Jefferson later wrote to John Adams, and I quote, "It was a bill for the more general diffusion of learning. This proposed to divide every county into wards of 5 or 6 miles square, like your townships, to establish in each ward a free school for reading, writing, and common arithmetic, to provide for the annual selection of the best subjects from these schools who might receive at the public expense a degree of higher education at the district school." And he went on to say, "Worth and genius would thus have been sought out from every condition of life and completely prepared by education for defeating the competition and birth for public trusts." Even though America did not start the public education system at that moment in time, those ideas and that philosophy of education as the great equalizer and tool to develop the talents of Americans regardless of the circumstances of their birth are the foundations of the public school system that we have today. Madam President, President Trump gave remarkably little attention to education during his campaign. He pretty much ignored the public school education system in favor of his $20 billion voucher scheme that would drain huge amounts of resources from neighborhood schools like the two in Baltimore that I just discussed. With the president offering only vague promises and pricey schemes, it's even more important that we have an education secretary with a steady hand and a deep understanding of the critical mission of the department. It's clear that Ms. Betsy DeVos is not the right person for the job. Ms. DeVos advocates a concept of industrialized, privatized, and for-profit schools. This thinking is too small and too cramped for our kids. Our goal should not be vouchers for children to try to shop for a school with no accountability for quality. Our goal should be a neighborhood school for every child that meets their needs. We cannot abandon the families who cannot afford to make up the difference between the value of the voucher and the tuition at the private school. What do we say to them? We cannot abandon the students who cannot get accepted into the private schools because many of these private schools say yes to some and no to others. What do we say to those who have the doors closed on them? We cannot abandon the schools that a voucher program would drain the resources from. $20 billion is a huge amount of the resources that we currently provide for schools like the two I mentioned in Baltimore City and schools in neighborhoods throughout the country. So instead of a risky voucher program, we need to make our schools better by giving them the flexibility to meet student needs and the support to make sure that our children are all ready to learn. In her hearing and the responses to the questions, for the record, Ms. DeVos displayed an astonishing ignorance about the agency that she intends to run, and indeed about the role of public schools in our country. All of us who have been part of this debate know that one of the most fundamental discussions in K through 12 policy has been over accountability and how best to measure student knowledge and school performance. There's been an intense discussion over whether to measure school and student performance by proficiency or student improvement and student growth. Ms. DeVos seemed totally confused about this discussion that's gone to the heart of many of the debates here in Congress. Perhaps we should not be so surprised that she has such a little understanding of the public education system, as she spent much of her career attempting to dismantle it in favor of private charter or for-profit schools. She's been referred to as the four-star general of the voucher movement. She has forcefully worked to expand vouchers, including spending millions on a failed ballot initiative to bring vouchers to the state of Michigan. When that didn't work, she created the Great Lakes Education Project to fund nonprofits and donate to state legislators who would advance vouchers and charters. With respect to the millions of dollars she and her family have spent trying to influence lawmakers, she stated, quote, "We expect a return on our investment." Well, she received a return in Michigan, where she played a role in a 1993 law that created incentives for charters to come to Michigan. The for-profit industry, in particular, responded, and they operate nearly 80% of the charters in the state of Michigan. In 2012, she pushed successfully for a law that allowed even low-performing charters to expand and repealed the requirement that the state publish annual reports on charter performance. I think we all believe that transparency is important, and it is shocking that there would be an effort to put the facts under the rug. After years of criticism, modest accountability measures were introduced in 2015, although Ms. DeVos opposed and successfully stripped a provision from the bill that would have established a commission to explore ways to improve Detroit public schools. Madam President, 70% of Detroit charter schools rank in the bottom quarter of Michigan schools. The nonprofit Ed Trust calls their performance, quote, a civil rights issue, unquote. In a report just last June, the New York Times called the situation in Detroit, quote, a public education fiasco that is perhaps unparalleled in the United States. It would be a big mistake to impose that fiasco on the rest of the country. Ms. DeVos has also advocated for online charter schools, and she was formerly an investor in the largest for-profit online school operator, K-12 Inc. In her response to questions to the record about this model, she cited questionable statistics for the accomplishments of several virtual academies. Those statistics were disproven in an article in Education Week, which compared them to the publicly reported figures used for state accountability. For example, Ms. DeVos wrote that Utah Virtual Academy has a 92% graduation rate. In fact, the most recently publicly reported 2%. The last thing we need is a Secretary of Education coming up with alternative facts. While I believe that nonprofit public charter schools are important incubators for innovation, they have to play by the same rules as the rest of our schools. But Ms. DeVos has rejected that equal playing field. In an exchange with Senator Kaine from Virginia, we asked her whether or not the charter schools would have the same standards applied to them as public schools that receive federal funding. She refused to agree. It's pretty extraordinary when you have a nominee saying that she supports a taxpayer-funded blank check for some schools. Our Secretary of Education must be a responsible steward of taxpayer dollars and ensure that funds are delivering quality and results for students. Another area where Ms. DeVos raises serious concerns is that of enforcement of equal rights, especially the rights of children with disabilities. All of us know the Department of Education has a very important job in enforcing civil rights laws and making sure that we have equal access to education throughout the nation. Congress has prohibited discrimination in education on the basis of race, color, national origin in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title IX of the Education Act Amendments of 1972 prohibited sex discrimination. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. But all of us know that as late as the mid-1970s, public schools still accommodated only about 1 of 5 children with disabilities. And many states had laws that explicitly excluded children with disabilities, state laws excluding children with disabilities. So when Congress addressed this with the passage of the IDEA legislation, it was a big breakthrough for our country and for our children. The idea was very straightforward and very simple, that every child deserves a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And the law requires schools to design an individualized education program for each child with a disability. IDEA has been a lifesaver for children with disabilities and their families. It has empowered them to get the quality education they could not earlier receive. And the law gives them the tools with which they can fight to ensure that schools address their needs, which is why it was so alarming at the hearing to hear Ms. DeVos say that the application of IDEA and the rights behind IDEA really was a state function. The same states that historically discriminated against these very children. That is not what the IDEA legislation is all about. It is a national standard to make sure that we do not have discrimination based on disability, and yet Ms. DeVos, in exchange, concluded with, quote, "I think that is an issue best left to the states." So, Madam President, whether it's her position with respect to vouchers and poaching resources that otherwise would go to improve our public schools, or a lack of support for the very idea behind IDEA, we have a nominee here who the overwhelming majority of the American people recognize is the wrong choice to be the custodian of the department that is responsible at the federal level for providing support and educational opportunities to our children. I do want to say, in closing, with respect to the issue of guns in schools, and Senator Murray, the ranking member, has addressed this as well. It was pretty shocking to hear Ms. DeVos trivialize the issue of gun violence in schools when she was asked about this by the senator from Connecticut, Mr. Murphy, quipping that guns might be necessary to, quote, kill grizzly bears. We've had lots of debates in this chamber, and obviously there are strong feelings, but I think we would all agree that it's not something that should be trivialized, the safety of our kids in our schools. So, in conclusion, Madam President, let us heed the words of the editorial board of the Detroit Free Press, who have witnessed firsthand the experiments that Ms. DeVos has made with education, and wrote in an editorial, quote, "Make no mistake, a vote to confirm Betsy DeVos as U.S. Secretary of Education is a vote to end public education in this country as we know it." In a speech in 2015, Betsy DeVos said bluntly, "Government really sucks," unquote. I suggest that she should not be leading the agency that is entrusted at the federal level with the education of our children, which, as our founder said, is really the root of equal opportunity and the opportunity for every child to achieve their dreams. And so I join with the distinguished senator from Washington State in urging my colleagues to vote no on Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education. We can do better. We can do a lot better for our kids.
Madam President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, constituents from every state who care about our public schools and our students in public schools have broken records calling us, their senators, in opposition to Betsy DeVos as Education Secretary. In the past few weeks, I've heard from thousands of Hawaii residents concerned about voting for an education secretary who clearly does not believe in our nation's public schools. I'd like to share two of their messages today. One constituent wrote to me, "Dear Senator Hirono, as a proud Hawaii educator for 30-plus years, I'm deeply troubled by the possible appointment of Betsy DeVos to the position of U.S. Secretary of Education. Although I would personally never consider applying for a job I am not qualified to serve in, it's baffling to me that our new Commander-in-Chief thinks someone who has no experience as a teacher or administrator could be remotely prepared to lead our nation in this role. I don't have to explain to you what a selfless calling being a teacher is, nor do I believe our Hawaii delegation takes educating Hawaii's keiki lightly. So I implore you to work with other leaders in D.C. to make sure we have a suitable nominee for this essential position." Mahalo, Sandy from Honolulu. Sandy and teachers like her devote more time and effort than is mandated to ensure that our public school students have a solid foundation in education and for life. Teaching is a calling, and I have met with many, many teachers who are totally committed to doing the very best that they can for their students, and they want nothing less from the next Secretary of Education. They deserve a better qualified, better experienced, better prepared, and more committed Secretary of Education than Betsy DeVos. Next, I'd like to share a message from Lorelei, a middle school principal on Oahu. Her letter begins, Dear Senator Hirono, as a strong supporter of public education, I ask that you oppose the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education. Educators and students deserve a secretary who can commit to supporting every student in all public schools and a leader that will work tirelessly to promote a public education system that provides each child with the optimum conditions for teaching and learning. Betsy DeVos's past work in education and her performance at the recent confirmation hearing demonstrated neither a depth of experience nor knowledge based in education policy and on critical issues facing the community. She ends her letter by saying, as a principal, I have spoken with teachers, parents, students, and community members across the political spectrum, and there is widespread agreement that Betsy DeVos is not the right person for the job. As Lorelei said, it shouldn't be asking too much to have an education secretary who will stand up for public schools and the millions of our children who attend our public schools. That person is certainly not Betsy DeVos. In his opening remarks at Betsy DeVos's confirmation hearing, the chairman of the Help Committee said that Ms. DeVos was in the, and I quote, mainstream for supporting vouchers to send students to private schools instead of investing in our public schools. This is not mainstream thinking. Being told otherwise is, again, dealing in alternative facts. The chairman went on to repeat a so-called argument that Betsy DeVos and other school choice advocates make, that vouchers are simply Pell Grants for primary and secondary education. Now, this is a real head scratcher, and I say, what? Here we go down the rabbit hole again, where up is down and down is up. Pell Grants and vouchers are fundamentally different. Pell Grants help offset the ever-rising cost of a voluntary college education. All colleges charge students tuition, and Pell Grants provide opportunity to low-income students to be able to go to college. In contrast, every American child has a right to a free primary and secondary public education. Vouchers actually take resources away from public schools and make it that much harder to provide a good education for all of our students. Vouchers take money away from public schools. Pell Grants don't. When a student uses a Pell Grant at a private college or university, it has no impact on the funding a state college or university receives. But when a student uses a voucher to attend a private school, it takes away money from local public schools. How is taking money away from local public schools mainstream thinking? The Secretary of Education should be focused on improving our public schools, not taking money away from them. Furthermore, saying that Pell Grants are similar to vouchers reveals a fundamental lack of understanding of the Pell Grant program. Among her many duties as Secretary, Betsy DeVos would be in charge of managing $30 billion of Pell Grants per year, which help more than 8 million students afford a college education in this country. During the 2014-2015 school year, more than 21,000 students in Hawaii were able to finance their college education with nearly $81 million in Pell Grants. Last Congress, I led legislation to protect and strengthen the Pell Grant program. But under Republican majorities, Pell Grants are under the constant threat of irresponsible cuts and mismanagement and dismantlement. Even though college today is more expensive than ever, can we really trust Betsy DeVos to fight to protect Pell Grants? Someone who equates Pell Grants with vouchers is not someone who understands her responsibilities under the Pell Grant program. So, can we really trust Betsy DeVos to support the Pell Grant program? I don't think so. I have spoken out against Betsy DeVos's nomination a number of times, but some questions need repeating. What are we telling our students if we have an education secretary who is not committed to improving the public education system so that our students can succeed in school and in life? 9 out of every 10 students in the United States attends public school. What are we saying to them? That the best we can do is to give them an education secretary who does not believe in the public schools they attend? Who doesn't believe that their education is worth fighting for? If this is the message you want to send to our students and their families, then vote for Betsy DeVos. On behalf of the nearly 200,000 public school students in Hawaii and their teachers and other educators in Hawaii, my answer is a strong, strong no. I urge my colleagues to question Betsy DeVos's commitment to our public schools, to the millions of students who go to public schools, and vote against her nomination. I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll, please.
Mr. Alexander.
The Senate remains focused on consideration of President Trump's cabinet nominees. Now, we've heard remarks thus far on the confirmation of Betsy DeVos, who would be the next education secretary. A vote on her confirmation set for tomorrow. Later this week, the chamber is expected to hold votes on Attorney General nominee Senator Jeff Sessions, Stephen Mnuchin for Treasury Secretary, and Health and Human Services pick Tom Price. And in her way, they've announced that they're opposed to the nominee, and they'll vote no on her confirmation. Now, assuming all other Republicans do vote yes and all Democrats vote no, there'd be a 50-50 tie, which would require Vice President Mike Pence to cast a tie-breaking vote. We have also learned today that at about 3:45, Michigan Senator Debbie Stabenow is expected to come to the floor. She'll be speaking in opposition to the nomination of Betsy DeVos. Senator Stabenow did meet with Mrs. DeVos last month, and she announced that she would oppose her given Mrs. DeVos's long record of pushing policies that have undermined public education in Michigan. That's the language that was in a statement sent out by Senator Stabenow's office earlier today. And again, the confirmation vote on Betsy DeVos set for tomorrow. We'll have live coverage here on C-SPAN 2.
Mr. President.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak this afternoon about the nomination of Betsy DeVos to be Secretary of Education. And I know we'll have some time later today and even tonight, but I wanted to review some of the concerns that I have about her nomination in the allotted time that I'll have, I guess about 15 minutes. Mr. President, the first concern I have is a broad concern that I think is shared by a number of senators on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. The ranking member, Senator Murray, is here with us on the floor, and I'm grateful for her leadership on this nomination debate as well as many other issues. But I guess the broad concern I have is Betsy DeVos's commitment to public education. I come from a state where we have had a tradition of public education since about the 1830s. I'm fairly certain, but I'll stand corrected, but Pennsylvania might have been the first state to have public education as far back as the 1830s. So it's part of the bedrock or the foundation of our state. And still today, 92% of Pennsylvania students attend a traditional public school. We have charter schools. We have roughly 175 or so. But all of those charter schools in Pennsylvania have to be, by statute, have to be public nonprofit entities. So public charter schools are what we have in Pennsylvania. We don't have for-profit private sector charter schools. It's just not allowed by law. There are some limited circumstances when one entity could affiliate with a for-profit entity, but we have nothing like Mrs. DeVos has supported in Michigan and across the country. So for a senator from Pennsylvania to be questioning a nominee for Secretary of Education about for-profit schools, for-profit charter schools, is unusual because we don't have that entity in Pennsylvania. So my concern is substantial, and I'll develop this later, about her commitment to public education. In fact, in my meeting with Mrs. DeVos, because of my concerns, I said something very simple, but I said it for a reason, to remind her about her obligation if she were to be confirmed. I said, you will not be the Secretary of Private Education. You're going to be the Secretary of Education, and for most of the country that means traditional public schools, and I hope that you understand that. So that's a broad concern that I have, and I'll talk more about it. But my line of questioning the day of our hearing, I should say the evening of our hearing, focused on campus sexual assault. And that, of course, is an area of urgent concern for a lot of people here, a lot of members of the United States Senate, but it's also, of course, of greater concern now because of her nomination. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me just walk through how I got to my questions with her. We know that the Department of Justice tells us that college women are twice as likely to be sexually assaulted than to be robbed in the time that they were in college. And this is a number that comes from the Centers for Disease Control. We also know that 1 in 5 college students experience attempted or completed sexual assault while they are in college. So this is a direct threat to young women all across the country. And I think we've only begun as a country, as a nation, I should say, to begin to take steps to combat sexual assault, to insist that colleges and universities do more, to insist that everyone in the education field, every person on a college campus, assumes some level of responsibility. One of the reasons we can start down that path and begin to be certain that we're at least beginning to wrestle with this problem and give young women on our campuses more protection is because of recent legislation. And we're not done. We've got a lot more to do. But I'll just highlight one bill that I led the fight on, the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act, known by its shorter acronym Campus SAVE. That became law back in 2013 when we were reauthorizing, a fancy Washington word for doing it again or improving law, when we were reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. And I was glad that we were able to take a substantial step to tackle this horrific problem of sexual assault on campus. That legislation was followed by regulations, and if I could summarize them, that law and the regulations that followed made sure that colleges and universities have clear guidelines, that victims know what their rights are, victims know where to turn in the event of an assault, that we do a lot more on the prevention, that bystanders can no longer be inactive, they have to be trained and prepared to help, and that the entire college campus is focused on preventing sexual assault and then making sure in the aftermath of an assault to deal with it appropriately. This legislation has helped campus communities respond to not only sexual assault, but domestic assault, dating violence, as well as stalking. And it does give students and employees the opportunity to do more than has been done on college campuses. When I was questioning Mrs. DeVos, I asked her if she would commit to upholding Title IX, the non-discrimination statute that includes important protections against sexual assault. I asked her very specifically about the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which had issued guidance back in 2011 that advises institutions of higher education to use the so-called preponderance of the evidence standard for campus conduct proceedings. Some may be familiar with that standard. It's a standard that we've used in our jurisprudence for civil cases across the country. So you don't have to prove, nor should a victim of sexual assault on campus have to prove by a higher standard, say clear and convincing is a higher standard, or beyond a reasonable doubt is a criminal standard. What the Department of Education said to the campuses across the country, the universities across the country, is the standard you should use is preponderance of the evidence. And they base that determination after consulting with experts and advocates across the country. So that was the state of the law, and is the state of the law, I should say, currently. the guidance from the Department of Education about that evidentiary standard, my legislation, Campus Save, and that's where we are now. So I simply asked Mrs. DeVos whether or not she would commit to enforcing current law and abiding by the 2011 Department of Education guidance. Her response was that it would be premature, I'm using her word, premature, to make that kind of commitment. I was stunned by that answer. Why would it be premature to say you're going to enforce current law? Why would it be premature to say that you can't make a commitment to insisting upon an evidentiary standard that is in place right now? That made no sense to me, and I don't think it made any sense to people across the country who've been working on this problem and trying to get the attention of the Senate and the House and any administration for years, if not for decades. We finally had arrived at a place where we're finally arrived at a place where we're at long last dealing with sexual assault in a very aggressive, inappropriate, and fair manner. And now we have a nominee who says that she's not sure whether she can commit to that. So that gave me great pause and is one of the reasons that I don't support her nomination, but I have several reasons. And I know I'm running low on time, but I'll wrap up this portion in a moment. Another area of concern is the answers to questions she gave with regard to specific questions about students with disabilities. This was a set of questions asked by a number of senators, but I'll try to summarize it this way. She seemed to have both a lack of knowledge, an apparent and I think obvious lack of knowledge about basic federal law. A law that was passed decades ago, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. She didn't seem to know that that was a federal statute. She seemed to assert that somehow states could decide whether or not to enforce the policy that undergirded that federal law. That, of course, is not the case. It's federal law, and we have to make sure that individuals, in this case students, with disabilities get the rights that they are accorded by virtue of that law. So her lack of knowledge in this area was of concern, but maybe even greater was a lack of, or a seeming lack, in my judgment, of determination to once again enforce this law, to make sure that on her watch, that law that would protect students with disabilities would be enforced to the full extent of the law and nothing less. She didn't seem to be willing to commit to that, or didn't seem to have the kind of commitment that I would expect from a Secretary of Education. What we would all expect, Democrat and Republican, I would hope, is a Secretary of Education who's a champion for public schools, is a champion for those children in public schools, will fight battles and urge states to make the investments in public education, would urge the Congress to make investments in public education, in early learning, and all of the concerns that we have about lack of funding in public education. I would hope that both parties would want a Secretary of Education who is a champion for students with disabilities, who would be a champion for those who are victims of sexual assault on our college campuses. But unfortunately, because of a series of questions both posed at the hearing and questions that were submitted for the record, written questions to which Mrs. DeVos gave written answers, I see that basic commitment lacking. And for that and many reasons which we'll develop a little later tonight, I'll be voting no on her confirmation vote. So, Mr. President, I appreciate this opportunity to share some of my thoughts and hope to be back later this evening. I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Secretary, call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak in opposition to the nomination of Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education. My mom was a public school teacher, and she taught second grade until she was 70 years old. And she loved teaching. Her favorite unit was actually the monarch butterfly unit, where she would dress up as a monarch butterfly, and she would teach the kids about a metamorphosis. And then the costume that she wore, she would also wear actually to the supermarket afterwards. And she was dressed as this big monarch butterfly with little antennas on her head and a sign that said "To Mexico or Bust," because that's where the monarch would fly on its way from Canada through Minnesota and down. And actually, it was at my mom's the night before her funeral at the visitation where I met a family that came up to me, and the mom was sobbing, and I didn't know what was going on. I'd never met them. And they had an older son with them who had pretty severe disabilities. And she said, you know, your mom had my kid here in school when he was in second grade, and now he was grown up. And she said he always loved that monarch butterfly unit. And after he graduated, your mom would continue to go to the grocery store, and that was why she would go to the store every year, where he had gotten a job bagging groceries. And she would stand in the line in her monarch butterfly outfit for years and give him a big hug when she got to the end of the line. And that was my mom, and she loved her kids, and she was a devoted teacher. I went to public school. Through elementary to high school. My daughter went to public school, and I just learned that basic right that we have in this country, that every child should have the right to education. And so that led me, after reviewing the record of the hearing, talking to my colleagues on the committee, that we do not share this nominee and I the same value when it comes to that public education. And I note that two of my Republican colleagues, Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski, have come to the same conclusion. One of the most troubling examples of Ms. DeVos's views came when she was questioned by two of my colleagues, and I note Senator Murray is here. We thank her for her leadership on the Health, Education and Labor Committee, but two of my colleagues, Senators Maggie Hassan and Tim Kaine, asked the nominee about whether schools should meet the standards outlined in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or as it's known, IDEA. Ms. DeVos said she would leave the decision of whether to offer equal educational opportunities to the states. This is simply unacceptable. It is not the kind of leadership we need. It is not why we have IDEA. And I think most education professionals and people who are experts in this area would know that that is not the answer. I occupy the Senate seat that was once held by Minnesota's own Hubert Humphrey. He was someone who, of course, was never at a loss for words. He delivered a speech to the Minnesota AFL-CIO 40 years ago. And one line of that speech is just as appropriate and meaningful today as it was back then. He said, I quote, "The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the needy, the sick, and the disabled." I submit that Ms. DeVos's opposition toward providing equal education opportunities to students with disabilities does not meet that.
All right, guys, we're going to cut this stream off, and we're going to go to an interview that took place today with Milo and Doug Hagman. Doug Hagman, Milo, and Jones. We're going to be listening to that here in just a minute. So hold tight. I'll be cutting the stream off here in just a minute. We'll be back up. Stay tuned.